Evaluations. I guess now that everything's online now, what we've been finding is that the proportion of people who are actually doing the evaluations has dropped a lot. To like some courses, we're not even having half the people fill out the evaluation. So I'm going to encourage all of you to do the evaluations, give a chance for your voices to be heard, especially if they're nice voices. No. But to have your voices be heard. I do want to remind you that as faculty, we don't get access to your specific comments or any, like, the feedback that you give is never linked directly to you. We can see online who has already filled out the evaluations, and that way it can be applied towards like professionalism in the course. We're not allowed to assign grades for filling out evaluations, but I consider filling out evaluations, seeing that you have filled out or chosen to leave it blank, but that you've logged in for it as part of professionalism. And let's see, yeah. So it is important that you let us know like what's working, what we need to work on, how great we are, how we're not so great. But it is an important thing for you to be doing. What we've got today, so I want to remind you that please submit your papers through Dropbox. In my other course, I was seeing that people were trying to upload, but the uploads weren't successful. So please, before you sort of log off, I'd like you to just double check to make sure that you successfully uploaded your paper to Dropbox. If you don't trust Dropbox, you're more than welcome to email your papers to me. I want to make sure that you get credit for your work, and so please, Dropbox does show you whether or not you were successful in uploading the paper or not. If you weren't successful, then please make sure that it does get uploaded, but I'd hate for a paper not to get submitted because of technical difficulties. So if you're not sure, please feel free to email a copy of your paper to me. I'm not asking for hard copies, I just want electronic copies. But if you don't trust Dropbox, email me, and that way you know you're covered. And I want to remind you that the deadline is December 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Okay, what I also have is I've uploaded topics that will be covered on the final. And I do want to remind you that, let's see. I do want to remind you that, let me make this bigger. This has already been uploaded, so you do have access to this. But I do want to remind you that everything that was covered on the midterm will count for maybe a couple of points on the essay question, well, the kind of essay question that you're going to get on the final. So what I would recommend is you might want to review your notes and read them over, but I'd say that 95% of the grade is for stuff that comes after the midterm. Just so that you know what the essay type question is going to be, is you're going to have a choice of 2 different types of passages, and you're going to get a whole bunch of questions, and you'll be asked to analyze that passage with those targeted questions. So you might be asked to identify phonology, you might be asked about orthographic patterns. So that's the way that the stuff before the midterm is going to be relevant. But working on your analyses of either textbooks, books, or children's writing should help prepare you for that a great deal as well. So I kind of think that the key issues in this course, the goals aren't just to know the theory, but basically be able to apply it. So the first topic that's going to be covered is semantics. So what's the difference between, and it's going to deal with everything that's in the text and the lectures, but some of the key issues that came out was connotative and denotative meaning. So what's connotative meaning? Or let's start with denotative meaning. What's denotative meaning of a word? Yeah, it's a dictionary definition. And what's the connotative meaning? Yeah, the implied. So it doesn't just have the dictionary definition, it also includes your knowledge of appropriate use of that word. What's the context that you would use that word in? What does it imply? So instead of just saying live, survive has a different connotation. What's the connotation that you would use survive for? In a life-threatening situation. So when you talk about survival rates, then you're talking not just about how, it's implying that how long you live after something, or the proportion of people who live after a circumstance. Okay, we also looked at linguistic meaning in terms of, so when we talk about linguistic meaning, what are we talking about? Are we talking about what the speaker intends, or are we talking about the words as they're written? Right, so the words as they're written. And that takes into account issues such as the language you're speaking, the dialect. So if we even contrast American English to British English, if we say suspenders in American English, what are we referring to with suspenders? Yeah, something that holds your pants up. So my poor grandfather, one time at synagogue, he got up and his belt failed him, and he wore suspenders for the rest of his life. Not a happy situation for him. Well, he does have a sense of humor, and he laughed about it afterwards, but at the time it wasn't so happy. If we talk about suspenders in England, what are we referring to? What do suspenders hold up there? You know? So American English, we would call them garters. So you would either use them to hold up stockings, or you would hold them to hold up socks. So my grandfather used to wear both kinds of suspenders, the British suspenders and the American suspenders, with his black socks holding them up, so he never had to worry about them falling down. But those would be examples of dialectical differences in terms of the literal meaning of words. Then we also have idiolectic, which would be words that have specific meaning, typically from an individual. And that contrasts with speaker meaning. So an example with idiolectic is, let's see, you might find with young children, they might have a word for their own invented words that consistently, if you say to someone, what's your wawa? It could, for that particular child, it could be a bottle. Another child, it would consistently refer to a pacifier, or it might refer to something else. So the other kind of linguistic, the other approach is speaker meaning. And with speaker meaning, the key issues that we looked at were things like literal and non-literal meaning. So what are examples of non-literal meaning? Pardon me? Irony. Yep, irony. So with literal meaning, bless you, with literal meaning, what we find is that the speaker meaning maps onto the linguistic meaning. With non-literal language, we're talking about situations in which the speaker meaning is different from the linguistic meaning. So you have to use other information to be able to interpret what the speaker is saying. So an example is irony. What are other examples? Sarcasm. What are other examples? Metaphors. And for children with autism spectrum disorders, like on the spectrum, non-literal meaning is something that's very challenging for them. So for the conventional sort of metaphors that people use, or the conventional types of sarcasm, one of the things that speech and language therapists may work with children with autism spectrum disorders or language impairments where they have difficulties with non-literal language, is explicitly teach them what the idioms mean, what What are examples of metaphors that are commonly used? Since one of the issues that comes up with children with autism spectrum disorder, just as an example to make it real, is that they tend to be extremely literal with language. And so they just take the literal linguistic meaning. Unless they've been taught what the idioms are, unless they've been taught what metaphors mean. They can use them, but they have to be taught that explicitly. Neurotypical children tend to pick those up more easily. But just as a developmental phase, just for you to keep in mind, to make the review session a little interesting, is kids under the age of 10 typically are very bad with non-literal language. They're okay with sarcasm when it's extremely marked and it's pretty conventional. But if you're a teacher or a parent or working with young children, you really don't want to use sarcasm with them. They're okay with the very conventional metaphors that are used all the time, like time is money, but they might still have questions about what it means. And they also have difficulty with some of the idioms, because part of it is the limited background knowledge. Okay, another thing that you'll need to know are lexical fields and semantic relationships. What are the relationships with words, among words? So one of the examples that I have up there are hyponyms and hypernyms. So what's a hypernym? What does it refer to? Yep, it's the big category. So with a hypernym, it would be, for example, dogs. And what would be hyponyms with the category dogs? Yep, different kinds of dog breeds. We also dealt with issues such as meronyms. What are meronyms? What relationship does that have a part of? So remember we were talking, this hyponyms and hypernyms, they deal with relationships of hierarchical natures. Meronyms are part-whole relationships. So your hand is a part of what? Your body. It can also be a part of your arm, which is a part of your body. And a finger is a part of your hand. So when we're talking about lexical fields, we're talking about the relationships of words with each other. Why is it important to know them? Like knowing these relationships, knowing the hierarchical relationships. Yep, that way it really pulls in your understanding of relationships between words. It pulls on your relationship in your knowledge so that if you just say dogs, it can be any kind of dog. But if you talk about a specific breed of dog, then yes, it entails the meaning of dogs, but it's a very specific kind. So it deals with your depth of knowledge when we go a little later on. Let's see, synonyms. We talked about different kinds of synonyms, because we recognize that with synonyms, words aren't most synonyms aren't perfect substitutes for each other. That they are not mutually substitutable. So that, for example, photograph and picture. You can easily substitute picture for photograph, but does it always make sense to substitute the word photograph for picture? No, because a picture could be a drawing, or it could be a painting. We also talked about antonyms and different types of antonyms as well. Gradable antonyms, complementary antonyms. So with the complementary antonyms, those are sort of your stereotypical true antonyms, like on or off. The gradable antonyms are more along a scale and a continuum. Okay. When we talked about words, the things that we've been talking about so far have been focusing on the words themselves and their relationships with each other. We also talked about how words can be categorized. So McCallum, Beck, and Cousin talked about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 words. So Tier 1 words are the general everyday words that a native speaker would be expected to know when they're entering school. So words like live, or happy, or sad. What were Tier 3 words? Pardon me? Yep, those are academic words that are content specific. So what would be examples of Tier 3 words for mathematics? Hypotenuse. Vector. And vector can also be in physics. But yeah, because there's a lot of math language in physics. So those would be examples of Tier 3 words. How often do you use vector in social studies? Or in biology? Not too often. Okay, so the Tier 3 words are the content area words that contain a lot of meaning. Words like bacterium and penicillin. If you don't know those words, then you're going to have a lot of challenges in that content area because there's a lot of conceptual knowledge that's content specific with them. And then we have the Tier 2 words. What are the Tier 2 words? Well, they're no longer linked to a specific content area. So these are the more advanced words, the lower frequency words that you would find in different content areas. So examples might be survive. You might have some academic words. So academic vocabulary, academic English could fit very nicely in Tier 2 words with words like compare and contrast, description. So description is more specific than tell me about, for example. Yep.
So Tier 1 is more like basic?
Yeah.
Like I don't, Tier 2 is kind of basic to me too.
So Tier 2 words, examples of Tier 2 words that would really highlight it, that are also academic words, nevertheless. Is that a basic word? No, but you can use it in different content areas. So the Tier 2 words, people might, they're kind of hard to define. That's why you often go, okay, we've got the Tier 1 words and the Tier 3 words, and the Tier 2 words are the complicated words that aren't content specific. So it's almost by exclusion. But with the Tier 2 words, those are sort of the words that are considered advanced vocabulary as well, richer vocabulary. And very often those are included in like the academic, it also includes the academic English words. They tend to be more precise than the Tier 1 words. So survive would be an example of a Tier 2 word, which is more precise in its meaning than than live. So what are synonyms? A lot of Tier 2 words are synonymous with Tier 1 words. So what would be synonyms for sad? Sad would be considered a basic Tier 1 word. Pardon me? Sorrow. That would be a Tier 2 word. What are other synonyms? Unhappy. that's a little more complicated than just a basic tier 1 word because of its morphological complexity. What else? Depressed and depression. So we've got words that are considered richer, more advanced, and those would be the tier 2 words that are often synonymous with tier 1 words. And so they would distinguish, those would be the words that also, if you're writing, that would be hallmarks of higher levels of education. Okay. We also talked a little bit about theories of word meanings, like looking at categories, family relations, semantic features. And then what we did was we moved towards sort of the psycholinguistics in terms of looking at what does it mean to know a word. Let's look at the cognitive aspect. So we looked at issues such as breadth of word knowledge. What's breadth of word knowledge? So if we're talking about breadth of word knowledge, what are we referring to? If someone has a broad vocabulary, what are we saying? They know a lot of words. We also talked about depth of word knowledge. So if you know a word deeply, what do you know? Yep, you've got greater understanding, the quality. You know, for example, different contexts to use the word. You know its synonyms. You know its antonyms. You might know its relationship, its hierarchical relationship with other words, if it has hierarchical relationships. So the more deeply you know a word, the more you know about that word. And you can vary in terms of breadth of word knowledge among the words that you know. So there are some words that it's like, okay, yeah, I've heard that word before. I'm kind of familiar with it. I don't really know what it means, but I kind of know when to use it. I know it's kind of a good word or a bad word. I don't want to be called that. And then there are other words that you can explain very easily to other people. There are other words that are kind of in between in terms of the depth of knowledge. You know how to use those words in a specific context. You know, the kids who study vocabulary in high school, they memorize the definition. They know how to use it in the exact way they've seen it in the textbook, but they can't use that word anywhere else. So that's kind of an intermediate approach to depth of knowledge. So what we recognize in terms of word knowledge is that word knowledge isn't just a categorical on or off type of thing. It really is a continuum. And then there's also flexibility in word knowledge. Knowing, for example, with words with polysemy, words that have multiple meanings, knowing what meaning is being used in different contexts. So I grew apples, I grew 5 inches. Different meanings, but you understand the meanings in the different contexts. Okay. We also looked at syntax. And one of the things that we talked about with syntax is that there's a distinction between competence and performance. So how many of you have found, let's use foreign language learning because it really illustrates it well. How many of you have found in taking a foreign language, when you're asked to conjugate verbs, you could do it on a test, but in a sentence and in your everyday use, you had a harder time using it? Okay, well that would be an example of a difference between competence and performance. That what you know are the rules, you might not necessarily actually be using in your use. I want you to know the different elements of sentences. So what's a sentence? Knowing phrases, words, clauses, the different kinds of clauses. and with the different parts of speech. And so we also talked about different ways of identifying parts of speech. So what were the different ways that you could identify parts of speech? Yep.
Well, I'm sorry, why didn't you get this first one? Difference between
Competence and performance? Okay. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head that would really illustrate. You know how you know the rule and you can perform the rule of you and I, and use I in that example. But then you might say you and me. Even though you know the rule, and when you sit and think about it, you have the competence to execute and articulate that rule. But in your everyday speech, you might not actually follow through with that rule. That would be the difference between competence and performance.
Performance is like
What people actually do.
and like in everyday conversation, and competence is when you write like an essay and like how you.
Competence is what you're capable of doing. So competence is what's your ability, what are you capable of doing? And so very often in oral language, because people are coming up with sentences as they're going on and they're speaking while they're thinking, they might make a lot of grammatical errors that they wouldn't do when they have the time, that they know that they're making these mistakes. So I'm sure when I talk to the class, I've had times where I've had run-on sentences. I'm sure that there are times that I've had incomplete sentences in my oral discussion with the class. That would be what my performance is like. But I am competent in terms of I am capable of writing complete sentences or saying complete sentences. I know the rules. But in people's actual performance, it might look different from what they're capable of doing. Okay. Notice how I picked on myself this time instead of picking on anyone here? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so when we talk about parts of speeches, what are ways of identifying parts of speech? What's the way that kids are taught? Yeah, they're taught nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And what are they taught about nouns? Right. So very often the approach that kids are taught to identify parts of speech is based on the semantics, the meanings. That a noun is a person, place, or thing. And we talked about some of the problems, for example, with verbs and with nouns and assassination. Well, is it a noun? But it's referring to an action, so does that make it a verb? So what linguists do is that they take a distributional approach, and they look at a couple of different things. They look, for example, at where it is in the sentence. What comes before it, what comes after it, the role that it's playing in this sentence.
But meaning is not, you said that meaning is not a good indicator.
Right, right.
So, would, like, if you ask, how do you identify it? So what do you say?
So if I ask, let's see, you would say that a common way might be based on meaning, and this is what kids might be taught. If I ask, how are kids taught to do it? And what are more reliable ways? So if I want you to go to address what the semantic approach is, then I'll be very clear in the exam. So if I want, if we use the meaning-based approach to identifying word parts, what are verbs? And then I'll put in brackets, what are kids in school taught? That will be sort of my clue to you. If we want to look at the distributional features, such as in terms of what kinds of words precede it, what roles it plays. So for example, a determiner comes before a noun, or it might have an adjective in between, or an intensifier in between. But that's a more reliable way of looking at the distribution of words, or looking at the morphological structure of words and looking at morphological clues. So those are the three ways that you could look at it. And the easiest way to teach kids is the least reliable way, which is the semantic approach. And the thing that's, excuse me, and the thing is that the semantic approach, the approach that teachers typically use for teaching it, not always helpful for English learners, because English learners might not have the vocabulary to recognize it. And the other approaches might actually be more helpful. So, little conflict there. Okay. I do want to emphasize that I want you to understand how to interpret the tree diagrams. But I'm not going to give you a question that will require you to draw the tree diagram. So I very likely might give you 2 tree diagrams and ask you which tree diagram corresponds to this meaning, this interpretation. And ask you to give an explanation why. So what were some of the instructional techniques we talked about for building syntactic skills? So one of the ways that knowing the sentence structure, that a sentence consists of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase part can actually be empty. And with the verb phrase, the head of the verb phrase, the verb, it definitely has to be there. But what's a verb phrase? Pardon me?
A verb consists of a verb and a noun.
Or a prepositional phrase. So it's quite possible that a sentence, a complete sentence, only contains the verb. That's the one part of the verb phrase that absolutely has to be there. The prepositional phrase or the noun phrase that goes with the verb in the verb phrase are optional. Similarly, within a sentence, the noun phrase can technically be empty. So you can have a sentence, stop, go. Okay? So when we talk about teaching to build syntactic skills, if we understand that a sentence is made up of a noun phrase plus a verb phrase, then what we could teach kids to do first is work on the simple sentences so that they have the basic elements that have to be there. I play. Sonny plays. And then we could teach how to elaborate on it. So how could we build on, one of the things that's an easy step to do is building modifiers, like adding adjectives, adding adverbs. So focusing on, okay, let's have the adverb. How am I playing? How does Sonny play? Sonny plays, what's one word that you could add to it? Sonny plays, what's an adverb that we could do to describe how Sonny is playing? Happily, noisily, messily. And so we could have children build it there. And then we could add elements to the sentences. Yep.
So when you're talking about expanding, that's more like transformation, right?
Well, with the transformations, that's looking at, for example, with the transformations, we're actually talking about adding constituents to the sentences. So with the transformations, I have transformations up there? Yes. Okay. With the transformations, it would be, for example, negation. It would be changing the sort of, knowing the surface structure and the deep structure, and how we go to building sort of the WH questions or the tag questions. He likes to play, doesn't he? She likes to play, doesn't she? Another instructional technique was the sentence combining. So how to build compound sentences. Complex sentences with subordinate clauses. Okay, we'll go down to discourse. So we talked about different types of speech acts. So what are performatives? Anyone remember what performatives are? Yeah. Yeah, that in the right context, spoken by the right person in the right place in the right context, that speech utterance is an action in and of itself. So if I were to say class dismissed, and not do it with a quote, class dismissed, but if I just said, okay, class dismissed, then what does that mean? You can leave, the meeting's over, sort of like, just like meeting adjourned, or I sentence you to 20 years, or I declare you married partners. So said by the right person in the right place, it leads to some sort of action. So it's different from a declarative statement like, I brush my teeth. Because by saying I brush my teeth doesn't make my teeth brushed. We also talked about direct and indirect speech acts. So what are direct speech acts? Close the window. What else are examples of direct speech acts? It doesn't even have to be a direct request. It can be just making a statement. Pardon me? It depends on the reason why you're saying it's cold in here. If someone asks, do you think it's cold in here? And you say, yeah, it's cold in here. That would be an example of a direct speech act. If you're doing what my daughter did to me in the car the other day, aren't you worried that your daughter's thirsty? It's like, oh my gosh, new stage with her. That would be an example of an indirect speech act. And I said, oh, really? Well, there's a water fountain. Let's go to the water fountain right by there. No, I don't want I don't want that. I want juice. It's like, not right now. So that would be an example of an indirect speech act, when you're making a request without explicitly stating it. So saying it's cold in here can be an example of a direct speech act. So what's a locutionary speech act? So that's the speech act itself, the process of articulating the sounds, what's the illocutionary speech act? Yeah, and so it also can be like the mood of the speech act. So is it something that's going to require a response from the speaker? From the audience?
I'm sorry, what was locutionary?
The locutionary, that is just the utterance itself. So the act of you, like if you're talking on the phone, it would just be the blah, blah, blah part. It would be the pronunciation, it would be the words that are chosen. It would just be a pure description of what's actually happening at that time. So what's the perlocutionary effect? So that would be the effect that it has on the listener, on the audience. And with discourse, we talked also about conversations and what's important in terms of conversations. So we talked about Grace's conversational maxims, the 4 basic principles that are necessary for a conversation to actually be successful, for it to work. So the first maxim is that it refers to the quality. So what do we assume when we're having a conversation with someone? That they're honest, that they're being truthful. That's part of the reason why people get away with lying, because people operate under the assumption that people are telling you truthful information. What do we assume with quantity?
The amount of information that is shared.
Yeah, that we're assuming that the quantity of information is relevant, that relevant details aren't being dropped out, and that you're not being flooded with so much information that you can't pick out what's relevant. What are we talking about when we talk about relation? Yeah, and so young children have a problem with relevance. You'll ask them, how was school today? And they'll say, I like cats. It's like, okay. So the adults have to sort of try and redirect to be relevant to the child. Otherwise, if you ask someone, how was your day today? I like cats. Okay, and that's relevant because, and trying to get it. I'm sure we've all had conversations with someone who is on their own track. And that's also why with the instant messaging, the lag time makes conversations so challenging. How many of you have had that experience? You're IMing with someone and you don't know whether to respond to what they just said or what they said 3 things ago? Or how many of you have had conversations with people talking and they're talking and talking and talking, and you have this great story that you want to share, and then all of a sudden they change the topic while they're talking? And it's like, oh, I can't tell my story anymore. Or if I do, then they'll think that I'm really weird, and they won't get it. So that's relevance. Okay, and how about manner? What are we referring to with manner for conversations to work? Yeah, that in order for a conversation to be successful, you have to communicate in a way that is comprehensible to the other person. Did I tell you the story about my ex when he got the text, he wanted to arrange a play date for my daughter, and said, oh, well, can we do it at this time? And he got an NP, and he didn't know what NP meant. And he said, no? What do you mean, no? It wasn't comprehensible input to him. He didn't know it meant no problem. So got very angry, and that conversation didn't go well after that. But that's one of the things, that manner can play a role. Similarly, children, sometimes the volume is an issue. How many, well, for those of you who have like nieces and nephews, I've had this experience with my daughter. I'm in the middle of preparing a meal in the kitchen, and say the blender is going, and she starts asking me questions while the blender's going, and she gets upset that I didn't hear her when the timing wasn't right. And so she still is learning about manner and making sure that the speaker can hear what you're saying. Sometimes kids deliberately take advantage of that, or people, you know, you ask someone something when you know they're busy and distracted because you want them to say yes. And so you pick the timing right where they can't really hear you that well. Another thing that you might see with manner within conversation would actually be in students' writing. How many of you might have noticed that if you've looked at writing samples with kids, with the words that they don't know how to spell and they don't know how to spell, their handwriting suddenly gets a lot worse to try and cover it up? That's another example of like manipulating manner. So with Grice's conversational maxims, it's really important. The assumptions for a conversation to be successful is that you operate under the assumption that someone's being truthful, that they're giving enough information for you to respond appropriately. They're not giving you too much. That's the nice thing about being a professor. I get to talk as much as I want and you still have to listen, but in everyday life, I don't get to talk this much. Relation in terms of being relevant, and manner that it's a comprehensible way. The other thing that we talked about was the given new principle. That conversations work if you both are on the same page, that you both share the same background information. But that conversations, they also typically work when you're sharing new information as well. So you might have seen a movie with a friend, and the given part is, yeah, remember this part of the movie. And the new part is your reaction to it, or what it reminded you of. So there always is that given new reaction going back and forth in conversations. Another thing that we talked about with conversations that I don't have up there, but it's also related to the indirect speech acts, was factors in terms of face saving. We talked a bit about the development of competence and conversational skills with kids. What are some of the things that they have to be able to do? Like joint attention, turn taking. That preschoolers start developing enough competence in conversational competence on one-on-one, but they have a hard time with groups, knowing when to jump in. That with preschoolers learning the pauses, they're not very good at noticing pauses, and they might wait too long to respond. So that's one of the limitations. They're better with adults. With discourse, we also talked about academic English. What are the features of academic English? That when we talk about discourse, we talked about different registers, so that the register of English that you use in conversation with your friends is different from the formal register you might use when applying for a job and at an interview. And we talked about the specifics of English, academic English. So what are some of the vocabulary features of academic English that makes it challenging, that makes it unique? Is the vocabulary different for academic English than it is for other registers of English? How is it different? Yeah.
There's more words.
Yeah.
You use because you have to express something.
Yeah, that it uses a lot more tier 2 and tier 3 words. That there's a different level of precision in the words that are used. How is the grammar different for the academic register? What kind of sentences do we typically use in the informal register, in conversational English with friends? What types of sentences? Do we use compound sentences? Yeah. Do we use simple sentences? We use a lot of them. Do we use complex sentences with subordinate clauses in everyday conversation? Not very often. But we get a lot of those complex sentences in academic English. We also use the passive voice a lot more in academic English. Do we use the passive voice a lot in informal conversation? Now, the main time that people seem to use the passive voice in conversational English, like conversational registers, is when they don't want to be blamed for something. Well, this broke. This was broken. I'm picking up something that had fallen or was knocked over. Then also with academic English, there's the sociolinguistic knowledge that's different. So the way that discourse goes on in the classroom is different. So how is conversation in the classroom? How is discourse used in the classroom, in the academic settings, different? How's it different at home with, say, questions and answers? It's more informal in home than in schools, definitely, in classrooms. How do questions go?
It's more question and answer in classroom.
Yep, it's more question and answer, but the questions themselves, in everyday conversation, you rarely ask people questions for things that you already know the answers. The only times you might be doing that, the main times you might be doing that, is if you're trying to trap them. You're interrogating them. You want to see, are they going to lie to me? But it doesn't feel natural very often to ask people questions that you already know the answer to. Or how do you feel in everyday conversation if someone asks you a question and then you turn to the next person and ask them the very same question and you go to someone else? What do you think about that in everyday life, outside of the context of the classroom? What does that communicate? Would you be offended if someone asked you a question and then they turn to the person next to you and ask the exact same question? If it was hanging out with friends and family? Unless you were saying, okay, I'm trying to get everyone's opinion. What movie should we see? What do you think we should see? What do you think we should see? And trying to build consensus. The rest of the time when someone does it, it communicates, I don't trust your answer. It's like, do you think these go together? I don't think you have good taste. Do you think these go together? Okay, I trust you. That would be kind of the subtext in conversation. In the classroom, it's conventional. It's very common for teachers to ask someone a question and ask someone else, and you already know the answer to the question, because question and answer is more of an assessment process that the teachers are doing, and less of a conversational sort of thing. The other thing that we also find different in classrooms is the idea that one person has the floor and gets to determine who else has the floor, who gets to speak the rest of the time. Okay. What I also want you to know is text structures that are commonly used in academic writing. So for example, the compare and contrast, the sequencing, cause and effect. So what's compare and contrast? What are you asked to do when you're asked to compare two things? Right, so compare and contrast. So with comparing, you're talking about how two things are similar, and contrasting is talking about how those things are different. With sequencing, what are you asked to do? Yeah, put things in order, the events that they occurred in, or items, or steps. And then with cause and effect, what are you looking at? Yeah, how one thing or a series of things made another thing happen. It was a direct result. So I also want you to look at dialectical, language variation. For example, looking at dialects that might be based regionally and socially. And one of the things that distinguishes regional variation from social variation often has to do with the prestige associated with the dialect, so that you tend to have prestige associated with social dialects and not as much with regional dialects. when it's based on social class. That dialects that vary by region tend to differ more in terms of phonology and prosody. So when you think of New York and what people talk like in New York, how do people talk in New York? We assume that the assumption is that people talk faster. They might have different words that they might use. So it might be semantic variations, vocabulary variations, as opposed to the South. How do people talk in the South? We talk about the Southern drawl, and that there might be different expressions and different words. But is there the same kind of stigma associated with, unless you don't like New Yorkers, or you don't like Southerners, or you don't like people from a particular region, is there a stigma associated with regional dialects? There tends not to be. But when we look at social dialects, that's when we tend to find that there is prestige and non-prestige dialects. And so what's the difference between a prestige dialect? That dialect tends to be associated with the social class that has the power, that has status. And with social dialects, we also have dialects that don't have the same social status, so that if people use them, then people would say, oh, you're not speaking English right. And so people talk about it drawing negative attention. But from a linguistics perspective, they all should have the same status linguistically. What's considered well-formed? It's considered in terms of appropriateness for the context. We talked a little bit about gender differences and how there have been changes in the way that differences that people have found among the way men and women speak. And that a lot of the differences might be associated with the power in the conversation, who has the power. So when we talk about language variation, one of the big tricky parts in looking at it is that the way that people use language, there's all kinds of social baggage thrown on top of it, and social judgments that might be thrown on it. And we looked at African American Vernacular English. And we looked at many ways in which it differs from Standard American English, the prestige dialect. So what are some of the ways that African American Vernacular English differs from the prestige dialect? So phonological differences. What kind of phonological differences were there? Mm-hmm.
Like you said, there wasn't a difference between like the TH sound and the S sound?
Right, in position, so at the end of a syllable or at the end of the word, then the sound often is pronounced with a. So you might hear bathroom, for example. So being aware of these differences, if you're aware of these differences, how can that knowledge be useful? So with kids learning to spell.
Can understand why they're making certain mistakes.
Right, and that you'd be able to recognize that if a child spells bath with an F, then it's like, okay, great, the child is hearing all the sounds, and the child is probably in the letter name stage still of spelling. So great, we know that the child is phonologically aware, we know that they know all the sounds, and you would address it the same way as a child who spells dragon or train with a CH. In other words, yes, they're representing all the sounds that they hear. This is a good sign. The child still has to learn the conventional spelling. So we consider this a good sign because this is the stage that the child's in terms of spelling. When it comes to children reading aloud, one of the things that a lot of elementary school teachers do is they listen to children reading out loud so that way they could get a sense of how their oral reading skills are developing, what's their fluency, what kind of help they might need. If a child is pronouncing things using African American Vernacular English phonology as opposed to Standard American English phonology, and the purpose is reading and learning to see if they can decode, then you could use that knowledge to say, yes, this child is being successful in reading. So if you're aware of the purposes of your lessons, then you're able to address the goals of the lessons. If the goal is pronunciation, focus on pronunciation, that's the time. If the goal is on decoding, then you can focus on the decoding then. Yep, so with the corrective approach, and that could also be for second language learners, where it takes more of a subtractive view, but with the corrective approach towards African American Vernacular English, it's the view that using African American Vernacular English is bad English, and so we've got to teach them proper English. That would be the corrective view. So it takes a subtractive view towards language and dialect. What does the contrastive view take? Okay. It's focusing on meaning, but what the contrastive view is, for example, you could still be correcting the child, but instead of saying, I want you to replace this, what you're doing is wrong, is in this context, this is what we're supposed to use in this context. This is for the appropriate context. Just the way that you might ask something from your parents in a different way than you would ask from your friends, and you would adjust your language. If you take the contrastive view, what you're doing is you're recognizing that everyone code switches between registers all the time. And that in this case with dialect, it's like helping the children master the two different kinds of registers and know when to use them in the different contexts. Okay. So the final part that I want you to be familiar with, again, would be the essay question, is that you'll be given some real examples of children's text. And you'll be asked targeted questions. So you might have child language use, texts, you might be given standards. So the way that you look through the standards, instead of looking through the standards, I might give you a standard and ask you to reflect on which level of English, what layer of English it's dealing with. Is it dealing with morphology? Is it dealing with syntax? Why you think it is? But it would be giving you real examples and asking you questions to apply different linguistic principles to that example. So I'm not asking you to learn the standards, but the purpose of last class was really so that you'd be familiar with reading them. So if I give you a standard, you'd know how to read it and you'd be able, it won't be so foreign to you. Does anyone have any questions?
Is it going to be as long as the last one?
Yeah, it's not going to be any longer. So it's going to be basically the same length as the last one with an extra half hour to work on it. Yeah.
Most of it
Right. So I'd say about 95% of the final is going to be focusing on everything after the midterm. And the essay question, you'll probably have a couple of points that might deal with a feature from before the midterm.
That's the only question that will be.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's only going to be in that essay multi-part type of question. Okay, I want to remind you that, let's see, you don't need to bring a blue book, you don't need to bring Scantron, it's going to be right on the page itself.
Is that at the same time?
It is, let me get my phone, oh, there it is. I've got it on my phone, so I'm 10:30? Okay. I'm giving 2 midterms next week, so I want to make sure I give you the right time. So yeah, it's 10:30 to 12:30 next Tuesday. Any other questions? Tuesday. Did I say Thursday? Okay. It's next Tuesday from 10:30 to 12:30. It's online, like on the course website, on the syllabus. So I know those times are right. All right. So it definitely is next Tuesday at 10:30 in here. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Professor,
Uh-huh.
I haven't written my paper yet.
Okay.
I'm working on it, but